The Russian Empire and later Russia itself are responsible for many crimes, from the partitions of Poland and the Holodomor to the war in Ukraine. But instead of facing this past, today's Russia keeps denying it and repeating it. Will Russia ever be ready to say sorry to Ukraine and to all the countries it hurt when it was still an empire? Here with me, Peter Eltsov, professor at the US National Defense University, historian and a specialist in Russian imperial ideology. Peter, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you, Natalia. I would just, before I start talking, I would like to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government or the National Defense University. So like all ideas, interpretations, what I present here are my sole responsibility.
Okay, good. Thank you. My first question is, why is there almost no serious conversation about the historical guilt in Russia despite centuries of violence, forced deportations, and cultural destruction?
There were, of course, cases in Russian history, if you look back, when there were such discussions. For example, in the late 1980s, like early 1990s, definitely under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, there was an attempt to rethink the Russian past. And of course, there was much discussion about those imperial atrocities, which you mentioned. Ironically, even Vladimir Lenin in the beginning called Russia the prison of nations. So there was an attempt there too. But somehow, you're right, miraculously, the empire has always resuscitated itself. So it collapsed in 1917, then again in 1991. But today, it is a really outrageous situation. There are not only no discussions on some kind of a collective responsibility or collective guilt, there is a denial of any wrongdoing in the entirety of Russian history. You can look a great example. There is a famous monument for the 300-year anniversary of the Romanovs in Novgorod, built so in 1913. And it doesn't have the statue of Ivan IV, because even the Romanovs thought of Ivan IV as a pretty monstrous czar. Today, I believe in Kazan or another city, they built a statue of Ivan IV under Putin. So like everyone who is an imperialist in Russian history is great, whether it's Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Stalin. The only two weak leaders, the weakest leaders are, in their opinion now, Nicholas II, because he abdicated the throne, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who liberated the Russian people. So yeah, this is a pretty, it's a pretty horrible situation that there is absolutely no thinking about the past from any kind of a critical perspective.
Yeah, okay, but if to stop on Ukraine, I mean, should the question of Russian historical guilt for this Russian war be addressed on the international stage, as as Germany once did with its Nazi past?
There is a lot of talk about this notion of guilt, collective guilt, and people usually follow the scholar Hannah Arendt, who said that if you blame the entire nation, then you can't really punish the specific individual. So she basically argued that there is no such thing as collective guilt. So like I may disagree with that because I think there are cases that there is both a collective guilt and collective responsibility. For example, the people who did Bucha, who are responsible for Bucha, they're all guilty. There is no question. The person who voted in Novosibirsk for Putin clearly is not guilty of Bucha, but is he responsible for the war in Ukraine? Yes, we can argue that the people who supported Putin, particularly like after 2014, like after the annexation of Crimea, when they kept voting for him and supporting him, yes, they're responsible. So this is collective responsibility. But again, like I would disagree with some of these people who say that there is no such thing as collective guilt. Yes, there is. Over 400,000 individuals, I believe, signed the contract with the Russian army just last year in 2024. Over 400,000. And they sign knowing where they are going, getting a substantial amounts of money. Are they guilty? I think they're both guilty and responsible. So there is a clear distinction here. And of course, there's been very much discussion about it in Germany after World War II.
Yeah, but do you see any parallels between the way many Russians today rationalize the war in Ukraine and the way Germans justified Nazism in the 1930s?
Yes, like absolutely. You know, an incredible irony of history, Vyacheslav Nikonov, who is a very senior Russian political figure. He happens to be the son of grandson of Vyacheslav Molotov, who of course signed the treaty with Ribbentrop on the division of Europe on the 23rd of August, 1939. Vyacheslav Nikonov called Russians the Aryans. And that was long before the war. And that was a post on the website of the Russian parliament. Even at that time, there was an outrage from some scholars and public intellectuals, so he removed that post. There is definitely this notion, the German notion of Urheimat, which is the beginning of its history. German archaeologists before were looking for the Aryans, for the beginning of their alleged civilization and culture. So this is the same. I mean, what are they saying about Ukraine? Ukraine is basically, in German terms, is a Urheimat for the Russian psyche, because their history, they argue, begins in Kiev. And even Chersones in Crimea, I think Putin called it a sacred city in his Crimean speech that Prince Vladimir was allegedly baptized there. This is ludicrous. This is a Greco-Roman city founded several centuries BC. It has nothing to do with Russian history. So, yes, there are parallels.
That's why they destroyed it, I think.
Right. And of course, there are parallels. We've discussed before how they justify their aggression. They're using geopolitical ideas from scholars such as Carl Schmitt and Karl Haushofer, including personally Putin. The huge difference is the Germans are over it. In Germany, no normal person is going to justify that period of time today. And there is this whole notion of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, a very long German word, which means reconciliation with the past. So they have to deal with their past. The Russians today don't want to deal with their past. That period of time of like late perestroika or early 1990s is over.
Yeah, Peter, but I want to go back to this personal guilt and shared responsibility. But if Russians support war in Ukraine with the silence, when they're, living their life, watching news, and they see definitely that Russia is killing Ukrainians, and they are like, okay, I don't want to go to protest because they will capture me to the prison for a few days or whatever. So is that can be, seen as a responsibility? Yes,
it can be definitely seen as collective responsibility. I'll tell you more. I left Russia 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, and I taught at high school at that time before I left, and some of the students now support the war. Like, I personally feel I haven't lived there for 30 years, but I do feel responsible personally, because sometimes I think, could I have done something differently? I was a history teacher, so those kids do not turn that way 30 years later, do not buy this propaganda. So, I would say definitely people who teach history at school, they are absolutely responsible. People, because they can't teach it freely today. People who are silent, don't talk about it. I cannot blame them. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. They have families. Not everyone is revolutionary. Not everyone is ready to go to jail. But are they responsible? Yes, they are. They're definitely responsible. Silence is also a form of responsibility, one could argue. There is no question about it.
Yeah. Would you argue that the war in Ukraine is not just a Putin's war, as a lot of people in the West even saying, but a product of a deeply rooted imperial thinking shared by large parts of Russian society?
So this is a difficult question. I'll tell you exactly why. For example, under Biden administration, that was a design policy of the US government not to call it the Russian war, but to call it the Putin's war. Putin's war. Because the Biden administration didn't want to alienate the Russian people. So they didn't want to say, hey, it's you all are guilty. And I said on the distinction between guilt and responsibility, it has to be substantial. Like, first of all, there are like over 1 million Russians who left Russia. There are right now several thousand political prisoners. There are people, I'm sure, who vehemently disagree with the war, maybe millions of them, maybe say 10, 15, 20 million. But yes, it's still, if there is a massive majority of the people who either support the war, probably the ones who really vehemently support is not the majority probably just don't care, they accept it. And yes, they are responsible. So yes, you could say that this is largely the war of the Russian people, not just of Vladimir Putin, of the citizens of Russia, not just the Russian people, because some like ethnic minorities who like actively participate in this war, they also support it because they joined the army. So I don't think it's Putin's war.
Well, I don't think neither, but I just wanted to hear your opinion. Is the term colonialism still a taboo among liberal or opposition voices in Russia? Or, I mean, I'm mistaken.
Yes, they're discussing this. I think Nikita Mikhalkov in one of his recent shows said that he was unpleasantly surprised to see somewhere in Siberia the term in Russian colonization of Siberia. Think about it, even in the Soviet Union, they said, yeah, colonization of the Caucasus, colonization of Central Asia, colonization of Siberia. Now they prefer the terms exploration. They argue on the level of the parliament that Russia is not a colonial power for some reason. I have a great quote from, you would never think, from Leo Tolstoy. You would never think of that person as a person who didn't love the Russian culture. He says, what is Russia? Where is its beginning or its end? Poland, the Baltic provinces, the Caucasus with all its nationalities, the Kazan Tatars, Fergana province. All these are not only not Russia, but all these are foreign nationalities, desirous of being freed from the combination, which is called Russia. He wrote it in 1906 in an essay, The End of the Age. Today, Tolstoy would be in prison for what he wrote. He basically said that even Siberia is not Russia. There was an independence movement by ethnic Russians in the 1860s in Siberia. And one of the founders of this movement, Nikolai Yedrintsov, after he was released from prison, he came to St. Petersburg and wrote a book, Siberia as a Colony. And one of his biggest charges was that the Russian government didn't take care of Siberia. The first university, I believe, was opened in Tomsk in 1770s or in 1880s or 1870s. So yes, there is no, and if you look at the wars, the longest war that Russia fought in its entire history, it was the war for the control of the Northern Caucasus. Over 50 years in the 19th century. A brutal war, including the genocide of the Circassian people. Look at the paintings by the famous artist Vasily Vereshchagin about the last stages of the conquest of Central Asia. The most famous painting is probably the Apotheosis of War, a pile of skulls. The notorious Battle of Geok-Tepe, which is Turkmenistan today, in the Second Battle of Geopolitical, 1881. General Skobelev and his men killed over 6,000 residents of the city, then chased the people who were trying to escape and killed another 8,500. So with all of that, yeah, it wasn't apparently, according to the Russian political elite, that was not colonialism. That was something else. That was all exploration, a peaceful reunification. They tried to emphasize, well, Ukrainians wanted to join the Russian Empire, the Georgians wanted to join, the Armenians wanted to join, and so forth. Some of that was more peaceful, but in general, the trend that was definitely a form of colonialism.
I'm curious, will this process ever stop? Would you call the war against Ukraine a final convulsion of the Russian imperial project or the beginning of its collapse?
I think it's the beginning of the collapse. I think so, because for a number of reasons. Think about it, even how powerful Marxism-Leninism was as an ideology, popular in many countries of the world, particularly like after World War II, during the process of decolonization.